This segment is on understanding shutter speed. Brought to you by Creative Online School. Shutter speed is basically a time value. It's a length of time that your shutter stays open. So when you take a photo and you press the shutter button, a shutter curtain actually opens and then closes. Most of the time, it's really fast. You hit the button, you hear click, click, and your photo is taken. You may have noticed a lag at times where it's not so fast, and that's really what the shutter speed is. It's a time value of how long that shutter is going to stay open. Here's a visual of what shutter speeds look like. At the top left, you see 1/125. That's 125th of a second. On the top right, you'll see with semi-pro or pro cameras that you're just going to see the number, but it's 1 over whatever that number is. So that's 2/100ths of a second at the top right. So it's always a fraction, unless you see it or not, unless you see these hash marks. That's actually a 6-second exposure. On the right here, where it has the hash mark in between two numbers, that's actually acting as a decimal point. So that's 0.8 seconds. Some camera models do that, others show the decimal mark. But that's not an 8-second exposure, that's 0.8 seconds. So how do you change your shutter speed? You're going to rotate your command dial. On a Canon, your command dial is going to be right above your shutter button. So you'll rotate that with your forefinger, and you should see on the display of your camera that you're moving your shutter speed, which is typically to the left of your aperture. Nikon is a little different. The command dial is on the back, so you're going to rotate that with your thumb. And as you're rotating that, you should see that you're changing your shutter speed, again, to the left of your aperture, as shown here. So as you're rotating that command dial, you're changing your shutter speed. This is a typical range of shutter speeds that you'll see in digital SLRs today. Anywhere from 8,000ths of a second, if you can imagine that fast, all the way down to 30 whole seconds, which is a long time to have your shutter open. So really we're talking about light with all three of these pillars of exposure, but before we talk about light with shutter speed, we'll want to talk about the effect that it has. So if you've had problems with blur in your images, shutter speed is your culprit. Faster shutter speeds are going to freeze motion. Like this image taken at 2,000ths of a second, you see the quarter dropped into the water and the water splash. It is a frozen moment in time. On the right, you see a slow shutter speed where you see the tail lights of the car are blurred, and that's a 2-second exposure. So the impact of changing your shutter speed really has impact on freezing your motion. So it's really why we make decisions on shutter speed, but of course it affects light as well. Here's a visual to give you an idea of the impact of shutter speed. The waterfall that you see here, taken at 250th of a second, shows pretty much the water droplets being frozen as they fall down. In the next image, taken at a 60th of a second, you start to see some motion blur. Even slower than that, at a 10th of a second, you see even more blur. And a 1-second exposure, you see you're starting to get that silky waterfall look that you may have seen before. So really, how do you know when you're freezing your motion? Well, it depends on your subject and how fast they're going, but this is a typical guide that may help. At 250th of a second and faster, you're pretty much freezing motion. That was intentionally the first slide of the waterfall. But if you're shooting sports, things that are moving quickly, the go-to for sports is 1,000ths of a second. On the left side, at a 60th of a second and slower, you will have motion blur. In fact, it may be so slow that you're going to need to be on a tripod to avoid camera shake blur. That was intentionally the second slide. At a 60th of a second, pretty much anything moving will be blurry. In between there, you kind of have a missing area, and that could go either way. It really depends on your subject. So how does it affect light? Well, the slower your shutter speed, the longer you're leaving your shutter open, the more light that can be absorbed by your sensor. So the faster your shutter speed, the less light we're letting into our camera. So just to summarize shutter speed, to get more light into our camera, we would slow the shutter speed down. The consequence is going to be blur.